This rule hasn't really needed to be enforced in the last few years in Formula 1, but it still very much exists today, and if new teams are to enter the sport in the future, then perhaps we might be hearing a lot more about the rule in the future. So what exactly is the 107% rule? Well, a driver has to set a lap time within 107% of the fastest time. Any time set outside of the 107% limit will mean that the driver will not be allowed to line up for the race. There are exceptions to this rule, of course, but to make an example of the rule, say the pole sitter sets a time of 1 minute 30 or 90 seconds. If you work out 90 seconds times 1.07, which equals 96.3 seconds, or a 1 minute 36.3, which basically means that the driver has to beat or equal that 1 minute 36.3 time to be able to participate in race day. The main reason why this rule was introduced was mainly for safety reasons, as cars that are too slow can pose a major safety risk to those having to constantly lap these significantly slower runners with the huge difference in speed. Other reasons included that the FIA and in particular Bernie Ecclestone were concerned that the smaller teams were more focused on promoting its sponsors rather than producing a competitive car, and that F1 management wanted to reduce the size in gap between the bigger and smaller teams in performance, citing that F1 is the pinnacle of motorsport and that only the fastest cars should be allowed to compete. The rule was meant to begin as early as the 1995 Hungarian Grand Prix after the rule was recommended by the F1 Commission due to the increasing gap in performance between the benchmark teams and the smaller teams like Forte and Pacific. So it came as no surprise that these two teams rejected the proposal, but the rule would eventually come into effect from the 1996 season, which by then Pacific were already out of the sport. And the rule would have to be enforced immediately at the start of the season, as both Forte drivers Luca Badoer and Andrea Montemini would set first qualifying times outside the 107% mark, and would not be allowed to start the race on Sunday. This would happen to Badoer 3 more times, and Montemini 4 more times for the year, as Forte pulled out of the sport after its last official appearance at the British Grand Prix due to bankruptcy. Minardi driver Giovanni Lavaggi, who came in for the final 6 events of the year, also fell victim of this rule 3 times. The rule would only be violated at one event for the 1997 season at the opening race at Australia, with both Lola drivers Vincenzo Sospiri and Riccardo Tosa Rosset, as well as Arrows driver Pedro Diniz, all falling outside of the 107% mark. This would be the only season event Lola would ever compete in thanks to financial problems. However, in Diniz's case, he'd be allowed to race despite the violation, as he did set a lap time in practice which fell within Jacques Villeneuve's pole sitting time. This was the first time a driver was still allowed to race despite being outside the 107% mark in qualifying. Rosset would be the only driver to fall victim to the 107% rule in 1998, breaching it 4 times at Spain, Monaco, Hungary, and Japan, and in particular in Spain, he missed out lining up on race day by just around 0.07 of a second, or 107.082% off pole. 1999 would see violations at 2 events at the Australian and French Grand Prix. Marc Genet would be the only offender at Australia, but because he crashed on his final flying lap before Häkkinen's eventual pole lap, they still let Genet race because he was on a personal best lap before the error, and his other time was within the original pole time he was chasing. At the French Grand Prix, 5 drivers fell victim to the rule, with Takagi, De La Rosa, Genet, Badoer, and even Damon Hill, who missed out by just 0.003 of a second, the smallest margin in the rule's history, but all were free to race due to having competitive practice times. The rule did not need to be implemented again until 2001, where Tarso Marquez was the main offender. At Albert Park, Silverstone, and Spa, the Brazilian did not reach the 107% mark, and was not allowed to race at Silverstone, but was granted an exception at the other 2 tracks. All of Enrico Bonaldi, Jos Verstappen, and Fernando Alonso were also offenders at Spa, but were cleared because of changeable track conditions. Alex Young would be the main offender in 2002, with him and the Minardi car making the infringements at the San Marino, British, and German Grand Prix, with all these resulting him in sitting out on Sunday. Takuma Sato in the Jordan was granted exception when he was outside the 107% mark at Australia, while the Arrows duo of Heinz-Harald Frentzen and Enrico Bonaldi were both at least a second off at France, with Bonaldi nearly 3 seconds off the 107% mark, as this was Arrows' second last ever weekend participation in the sport. At the end of the 2002 season, the 107% rule was abolished due to the new qualifying system of 2 ordered laps coming in for 2003, meaning that there was likely to be more variation in lap times. So therefore the 107% rule became a bit outdated. 8 years later, and in 2010, the rule made its return, coming back partly due to F1 trying to establish a benchmark for the newer teams like HRT, Lotus, and Virgin Racing, as well as a more consistent qualifying system now being used with the Q1, Q2, and Q3 sessions, enabling a better indicator of true performance. Although there have been many violations in its reintroduction, the only violations that have resulted in drivers sitting out of the race were the violations at the 2011 and 2012 Australian Grand Prix, committed by HRT for both years, with Fit Antonio Liuzzi and Narayan Karthikeyan both missing out in 2011, and Karthikeyan and Pedro de la Rosa, the unfortunate drivers, in 2012. The most recent breach was in 2018, where Brendan Hartley was about 114.4% off the pole time set by Sebastian Vettel, but was granted permission to race as he was easily within the 107% mark in practice. So my thoughts on the rule now. Although the rule is kind of useless these days, with the standards of racing from all the lower end teams being much better than what was the case 25 years ago, I still do think that it is a very handy rule to have in place for the future, as there will surely be new teams that will eventually enter the sport, and the 107% rule gives those teams the bare minimum mark that their car has to be able to reach when it enters onto a track. It also ensures that only serious entries will compete in race day, as the FIA definitely don't want a repeat of the Lola fiasco, which looked like they were mainly there just to promote their sponsors. And most importantly, it ensures that the performance levels of all teams are at the absolute top standard, as which should be the case for the highest level in all of motorsport. And that is the end of the video. What is your take on this? Let me know in the comments section, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel with more content coming soon.